Before these stories begin, pause for a moment. Look around you. Notice where you are. Notice the time. Then listen. What you are about to hear was not written to entertain. These stories survived because someone endured long enough to remember them. Most of these events were never spoken of openly. They were hidden in old records, broken journals, and quiet testimonies. Some were written by survivors. Some were written by men who watched others disappear. Tonight, you are not watching history. You are standing inside it. At night, the marsh never sleeps. It breathes, it shifts, it pulls. In the low coastal lands of colonial Georgia, the ground was never fully solid. Water rested just beneath the surface, waiting for weight, waiting for fear. The air was thick and wet, filled with insects that hummed without stopping, so even silence felt alive. On one plantation near the Altamaha River, 6 enslaved men disappeared just before dawn. There was no alarm, no sound of struggle, only empty sleeping quarters and disturbed earth leading toward the marsh. By sunrise, armed men were already gathering. They brought dogs. They brought rifles. They brought torches. They believed the marsh was a trap. They were wrong. The 6 men had planned for months. They knew the land better than anyone who owned it. They worked in the fields by day and watched the marsh by night. They knew where the ground sank, where the water stayed shallow, and where it swallowed a man whole. They entered the marsh barefoot. Shoes leave tracks, bare feet disappear. They moved slowly, never rushing. They walked through water when they could, knowing it erased scent. When they reached dry land, they doubled back, stepping in their own prints to confuse the trail. When the dogs arrived, the men were already gone. The hunters followed anyway. By midday, the heat became heavy. The air did not move. Mosquitoes swarmed the hunters' faces and hands. Sweat blurred their vision. Every step made a sound: water, mud, reeds snapping under boots. The fugitives heard everything. They hid beneath the surface, using hollow reeds to breathe. Mud covered their skin. Insects crawled into their ears and mouths. They did not move. They did not speak. Time slowed. One hunter fired at movement in the fog. Another sank suddenly and never came back up. By nightfall, fear replaced confidence. The marsh looked the same in every direction. Torches reflected off water, creating false paths. Sounds echoed and returned distorted. Some hunters swore they heard whispers. Others heard splashing behind them when no one was there. The 6 men moved again, quietly, carefully. They traveled only at night. They rested during the day beneath thick reeds. They communicated by tapping wood against wood, signals learned in secret. By the 3rd day, the dogs refused to move forward. The hunters argued. Supplies ran low. Sleep disappeared. One man claimed the marsh was watching them. Only one hunter returned to the plantation. He said the men had become part of the land, that the marsh had closed behind them. The 6 men were never found. Years later, attempts to build roads through that section of marsh failed again and again. The ground collapsed without warning. Locals said the land remembered. Cold does not arrive suddenly. It settles in slowly, quietly. Then it stays. In the winter of 1919, during the Russian Civil War, a group of political prisoners was being marched across Siberia after rail lines failed. Snow covered everything. The sky stayed pale and empty. Wind erased sound. 7 men escaped during a storm. They had no map, no shelter, almost no food. Behind them, armed guards followed. Most men would run towards safety. These men ran into the storm. They understood that vision disappears before distance in white snow. The wind erased their tracks within minutes. They moved at night, guided by stars when possible. During the day, they buried themselves beneath snowbanks to avoid being seen. Cold became their greatest enemy. Fingers went numb. Feet lost feeling. Breath burned. One man gave his coat to another. Another collapsed and never rose again. They did not bury him. They used his body to block the wind while they slept. The guards suffered worse. Their boots froze. Their rifles jammed. Hunger weakened them. The escapees left false camps behind, ashes buried beneath snow, footprints leading nowhere. The guards followed these signs again and again, walking in circles without realizing it. Days passed. Men began to hallucinate. Some heard voices calling their names. Others saw shapes moving across the snow. One guard shot at nothing and screamed. When the storm finally cleared, only 2 guards remained alive. They turned back. 3 prisoners reached a distant settlement weeks later. They were thin, damaged, and silent. They never explained how they survived. The cold had taken enough. The jungle is never quiet. It only listens. In the Congo Free State, under forced labor rule, a group of villagers fled into the Ituri forest after refusing orders. European officers followed with rifles and confidence. They believed weapons mattered more than knowledge. The villagers knew better. They walked on roots instead of soil to avoid leaving tracks. They traveled upstream to confuse scent. They used bird calls as warnings. At night, they stood completely still, letting insects crawl across their skin. The forest watched everything. The officers fired at shadows. They shouted to one another. They lost direction. One officer stepped off a familiar path and disappeared. Another was found days later, alive but unable to speak. His eyes never focused again. The villagers waited. They let hunger weaken the hunters. They let fear grow. Eventually, the officers retreated. Within hours, the forest erased every trace. To this day, locals say that section of jungle feels different, quieter, aware. The sea does not care who you are. In 1943, a military transport ship was sunk without warning. 23 men reached the water. Oil burned on the surface. Debris floated everywhere. By nightfall, only 11 remained. They tied themselves together using belts and torn cloth. They rationed movement to conserve heat. They ignored the sounds beneath them. Sharks circled. Days passed. Men drifted into madness. One unfastened himself and swam away. No one stopped him. When rescue came, only 4 survived. They did not celebrate. They stared at the water. High mountains remove mercy. A group of indigenous porters fled into the Andes after being falsely accused by an expedition. They moved upward, where air thins and sound disappears. They crossed paths not marked on any map. They slept standing against stone. They drank melted snow. They let storms erase them. The pursuers collapsed one by one. When the survivors reached a hidden village, the elders said only one thing. The mountain allowed you. Nothing more. These were not victories. They were survivals. No songs were written. No celebrations held. The land remembers. And now, so do you.